Hello, and welcome to today's virtual gin-themed running tour of London. My name's Vanessa, and I'm the founder of Secret London Runs. I set up the company about 4 years ago so I could mix my love of running and history. And about a year into it, I realised that I could also introduce my third great love, gin. So I wrote the Secret Gin Run, which is a 10-kilometre running tour of London's gin-themed history, and it ends with a well-deserved gin and tonic. Thousands of wonderful, wonderful people have run that with me and the rest of my team over the past 3 years. But obviously all of our tours are now postponed due to COVID-19. So I wanted to do something where I could still share those 3 great loves with you. So today I've written a little 5K version of a period of London's gin-related history that I find really, really fascinating. It's between about 1700 and 1760, and this was a time where London got so sozzled on gin that historians have now dubbed it the 18th century gin craze. Now, 60 years of sipping back on a Hendrix with some Fever-Tree and a little bit of cucumber, that sounds all right, doesn't it? But this was worlds away from what you might be imagining. This was a craze that affected the inner city slums of London, and the addiction, the violence, the social devastation that it caused has been likened to the crack cocaine epidemic in 1980s America. So it really was horrific, and it really had such widespread effects that I really wanted to just focus on that today. So we're starting off at the City of London distillery. It's my favourite of the 24 London distilleries, and I thought we're going to end here as well, because I thought if you do come back here to do the tour on your own, it would be a nice place for you to have a well-earned drink of gin and tonic. I recommend their batch #1, but their Christopher Wren gin has won lots of awards. Anyway, we're gonna head off to 1702 and our first stop, which is just a couple of minutes away. So we've started today's tour on Bride Lane, which is just off of Fleet Street. This is Bride Court, which is really cute. I really like it. And we're now just on our way to St Paul's Cathedral for the first stop of the tour. Now, I'm not going to be talking all that much about the causes of the 18th century gin craze. I love looking into reasons that it broke out. They weave together centuries of economic, political and social history. We do discuss them in the 10K version of this tour, but it is quite a long and complicated subject, so I thought I'd leave it for another day. I love this approach here that we're running up now, the approach to St Paul's from Ludgate Hill. I used to work in an office just on the right here, and I never tired of that view coming up to St Paul's. Here we are. There were many causes of the 18th century gin craze, but we're going to begin here with Queen Anne coming to the throne in 1702. Now, her statue is here outside St Paul's Cathedral because she was ruling at the time that Sir Christopher Wren rebuilt St Paul's Cathedral after the Great Fire of London. And once this statue was defaced with the lines brandy nan, left in the lurch, with your face to the gin shops and your back to the church. You might have guessed, but Queen Anne loved a drink, and brandy was her favourite. So for many years, French brandy had been the drink of choice amongst the gentry. But during Anne's reign and before that, we were at war with France, and there was a blockade on French imports. Gin had started to trickle in among the gentry, but this was a lovely high-class gin that was made according to the standards of the Worshipful Company of Distillers. So obviously there just weren't enough spirits knocking about for Anne, so she reversed the charter with the Worshipful Company of Distillers. What this meant was that gin went from being something that you had to be part of this exclusive club to make, to anybody and everyone being able to make it. And they did. The result was absolute carnage. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that as we head towards the Old Bailey.
So we're just going back on ourselves for about 100 metres, and then we'll take a right up Old Bailey, which is the name of the road that the Old Bailey is on. So back to the chaos caused by Anne. By 1730, there were 7,000 gin shops in London. Every fourth house was a gin shop. Gin was everywhere. And for the first time, gin was cheaper than ale, and Londoners drank it by the gallon. Those living in the inner city slums became degenerate alcoholics. Scenes of mass gin-fueled public nudity were part of everyday life.
So why was everyone stripping off? Well, gin was now cheaper than beer. So for a few pennies, the poor could forget that they lived in workhouses and slums, that they had hunger pangs, and just be absolutely annihilated. But gin still cost something, and this was an addiction. They needed to keep on fueling it. So they needed to find their money from somewhere. And cloth was actually quite expensive. This is a couple of centuries before the Industrial Revolution, so clothes were actually quite expensive. So one of the best ways to make some quick cash was to sell the shirt off your back, or indeed the clothes of your children. We're here at the Old Bailey so that we can talk about one of the most notorious incidents of the 18th century gin craze. It was the case of a lady called Judith Defer that was heard here at the Old Bailey in 1734. Her crime was killing her own 2-year-old child. So Judith went to the Bethnal Green workhouse with her 2-year-old child, and she said, look, I'm too poor, I can't look after this child, knowing that the workhouse would give her child a brand new outfit. So then a few days later, Judith Defer, still playing the loving mother, went to the workhouse and said, please can I take my baby out for the day? So took the baby out, strangled it, and sold its clothes for 1 shilling and 6pence so that she could spend it on gin. She was hanged, and the case shook the nation of what a mother would do for gin. Meanwhile, terrible things were going on all over London, and we're now going to go to the parish of St Giles, which was the worst affected slum of the gin craze, and I'll tell you more about what was happening on the way there.
This is the longest run of the tour. I think it will probably take us about 7 minutes. And we're heading pretty much in one big straight line up Charing Cross, through Holborn, and then to St Giles in the field. Usually I don't get to speak to the whole group like this as we run. There are often about 15 people on one of our tours. So we save the history for when we stop, and then we chat on the run. So I really am feeling the absence of fun and interesting people to chat to between the stops. But I guess it does mean that I can tell you a bit more about some of the things that we pass. So coming up, we've got Holborn Viaduct. So you can recognise it by the red railings and the statues on the side. So this is a magnificent feat of Victorian engineering. It was built over Farringdon Street and the now subterranean River Fleet. So you might not know, or you might know, that London has got loads of rivers, subterranean rivers that are now below what London's built on, and you could do a whole tour just on that. So I'll leave it at that for today. So maybe during this long stretch I can tell you a bit more about Secret London Runs. So we give and our tours really. So we give a number of different themed running tours of London. Gin, obviously, craft beer, running between the breweries and learning about the brewing history of the East End. Jack the Ripper, running between the murder sites, talking about the victims, the life in the East End, obviously all of the suspects. Crime and Punishment was new for this year and we haven't got to run it yet because we had to cancel or postpone all of them just as we were about to get going. The Great Fire of London, the lovely 5k one where lots of children come on that one. We've got a tour about the London Marathon. It's 11 miles and it goes through the highlights of the route and talks about the history of the race. We've got a Christmas lights tour that goes through the best Christmas lights in London. Everyone wears Santa hats, we play Christmas songs. It's a really lovely way to get into the Christmas spirit. And we've also got 2 street art tours as well. And street art's become a real passion of mine in the last couple of, 2 or 3 years. We've got a Shoreditch street art tour, and then also I spent my maternity leave researching a new tour in South London, and I do believe we're about to find some street art just on the left here by Nathan Bowen. So once you start noticing Nathan, you will see him absolutely everywhere. He used to be a builder, so you can see that the characters in the artwork here have got builders' hats on. But he paints all kind of things, but it's a very distinctive style, and you will start to notice him all around London and the rest of the world, actually. Sorry, I got a bit distracted during the hard sell by some street art, but all of our tours they're chilled out in terms of pace expectation. It's always lovely people that come on them, and we're about using running to explore London rather than it being about the running in itself. So, I've accepted that I'm never gonna win any Olympic medals for my running, but it's about how we use running and the enjoyment we can get out of it through exploring that I really love. So I better get back to some gin for you. So gin was blamed for pretty much all of the social problems in the first half of the 18th century. A rise in prostitution, misery, madness, robbery. The gin produced at this time was toxic, and this was due to Anne's big decision in 1702 to reverse the charter with the Worshipful Company of Distillers. So I'll tell you a bit more about them. The Worshipful Company of Distillers was established in 1638 by Charles I, and worshipful companies were like medieval trade associations, and the Worshipful Company of Distillers exercised a monopoly on gin distillation within the cities of Westminster, London and beyond. So if you wanted to make gin, or vinegar, which I find less exciting, so if you wanted to make gin within a 21-mile radius of London, then you had to be part of the guild. And what this did was ensure a high quality standards during gin production. When Anne reversed the charter with the Worshipful Company of Distillers, she effectively removed all of those quality guarantees. So the gin produced was lethal. It was often mixed with sulfuric acid or turpentine, and I've heard some people say they did that to make it taste better. And it was cheap, so it affected the worst parts of London, like the parish of St Giles, where we're heading now. It's now close to the fashionable Covent Garden and Oxford Street, but in the 18th century, it was one of the worst slums in Britain, a site of overcrowding and squalor, and the gin craze only made those conditions worse. We're very nearly there now. So there were stories of people going blind due to gin, and by 1723 the death rate was higher than the birth rate. Historians estimate that a staggering 75% of babies died before they reached the age of 5. Babies were born deformed because their mother had drunk so much gin whilst they were pregnant. Or mothers addicted to gin would neglect their children or give their babies gin to quieten them. And thus we first heard the term mother's ruin used to describe gin.
The role of women was a key focus of the anti-gin campaign. Women should be holding our society together, not drowning themselves in gin. And if they're not busy raising the next generation, then what will become of it? There was moral outrage. I'm here in the parish of St Giles, which was one of the worst affected areas of the gin craze. And although you can still see the church of St Giles in the field, then there's not much of the residential area that remains. Tottenham Court Road Station is just up there, and so most of the area has been redeveloped in line with Oxford Street and the commercial shopping area. But the gin craze hit here so hard that William Hogarth used it as the setting for his famous print, Gin Lane.
So Hogarth was a social commentator, and he documented many of the social problems of the 18th century. So here, you should see it up on your screen, we have Gin Lane. So here's mother's ruin depicted in the front, abandoning her child. We've got a beggar and a dog fighting hungrily over a bone, a pawnbroker doing a roaring trade as people swap their goods for money that they can go and spend in the gin shop. So we've got lots of skeletal imagery, lots of bones. It is important to remember that Gin Lane isn't an entry from Hogarth's sketchpad when he visited the parish of St Giles. It was a carefully constructed print to put pressure on the government to take action against gin. The print was accompanied by a pretty fiery verse from dramatist James Townley. Gin cursed friend with fury fraught, makes human race a prey. It enters by a deadly draught and steals our life away. At the same time as he published Gin Lane, Hogarth also printed Beer Street, which I've hopefully got showing on the screen here in a second. Let's just hang on a minute. Right, here we go, Beer Street. So you can see here we've got a comparatively happy and carefree scene. There are tankards of foaming ale, healthy people, jolly times celebrating the King's birthday. The only business that's in trouble in Beer Street is the pawnbroker. You can see his crumbling house in the front of the scene compared to all the quite nice looking properties in the rest of the scene. So essentially what Hogarth is saying is, drink beer and you'll be fine. Drink gin and you'll abandon your children and die. And although there is a lot of speak about the moral outrage of the anti-gin campaigners and the hyperbole that they created, I don't think it was necessarily a bad thing that Hogarth and others wanted to bring about social reform. Gin was a huge problem. The statistics about the death rate and child mortality rate are horrific. Hogarth was also very involved in the foundation of the Foundling Hospital, a place for orphan children. And his demand for gin reform was motivated, at least in part, by improving the lives of otherwise abandoned children. So I don't think Hogarth was necessarily the jumped up toff, looking down on the working classes that history sometimes paints him out to be.
I'm here just off of Bow Street, really near to London's West End, to look at this plaque. Even when I zoom in as far as the camera allows, it's still quite hard for you to work out the name just under the fold of the sign that says Henry Fielding brackets novelist. But Henry was a novelist and he was also a fierce campaigner in the anti-gin movement. So Fielding, Hogarth and the rest of the anti-gin movement lobbied Parliament to pass laws that would curb London's gin consumption. Between 1736 and 1751, there were 5 main laws. each of them trying to get London to stop drinking gin. Isn't it amazing? I always find it surprising and fascinating that gin was being drunk to such an extent that the government had to pass laws to stop it. Anyway, there are five main acts. I'm not going to bore you with each of them, but I am going to tell you a little bit more about them as we go on to our next stop. It's a reasonably long... I must admit, it's really quite nice telling you about Henry Fielding without all the diners at Zizi's listening in. This is a stop on the 10K tour, and in the summer we always have quite an audience. So we're now running in the West End, down Bow Street, past the Royal Opera House on the right, and in a couple of minutes we'll see the Lyceum Theatre, which is usually showing The Lion King. Of course, the coronavirus outbreak has had a devastating impact on the theatres, and many are expecting that they won't be able to reopen until 2021. I'm really pleased that just before this happened, I managed to see one of my favourite productions, Six the Musical, with my nieces and sisters. If you haven't heard of it, then it's wonderful. Henry VIII's ex-wives have come back and formed a girl band. What's not to love? I've been twice and will definitely go again when it opens. So I forgot to mention why there's a plaque for Henry Fielding on Bow Street. As well as being a novelist, Henry Fielding was a magistrate, and he also founded the Bow Street Runners, which is widely thought of as London's first professional police force. The force was founded in 1749, and it consisted of 6 men, and their offices were on Bow Street, near to the plaque that we saw. So this is the last run of the tour today. We're making our way back towards the City of London distillery off Fleet Street. So it's a reasonably long run, and there is a quicker way we could have gone, but the streets are so nice and quiet at the moment, and I wanted to give you a glimpse of the River Thames whilst it's all so quiet. So I hope you enjoy it. So there's the Thames, our first view of it on the tour today. We are just going to have to cross Embankment, which is still quite busy. And the thing that you might notice as we run along here is how many people seem to have taken up cycling. It's absolutely relentless. So we're allowed out at the moment for exercise. Oh. So it's VE Day today, and it looks like we've managed to catch the Red Arrows doing their fly over the River Thames. We'll just have a quick pause to have a look at that. Wow. Now, I promised to talk to you about the gin acts on this bit of the run, and I'm sure you can wait no longer. The first of the main gin acts was passed in 1736. There had actually been a couple of laws passed before this aimed to stop London's gin drenching. And actually, as a side note, it depends on which historian you talk to as to how many gin acts there even were. But the Gin Act of 1736 targeted gin sellers. The distinction between gin distillers and gin sellers is quite important here. It was estimated that there were about 1,500 gin distillers in London during the 18th century gin craze. Most of them were very small operations, and they sold the gin on to about 7,000 gin shops.
And the 1736 Gin Act said that gin sellers needed to take out an annual licence to sell gin for £50, which is about £8,000 in today's money. The government relied on informants to let them know when somebody was selling gin without a licence. The result of the 7,000 gin shops, just 2 took out a licence, and everyone else carried on as normal. Suspected informants were mobbed in the streets, sometimes by hundreds of gin enthusiasts. At these gin riots, the mob could be heard chanting, "No gin, no king." And of course, gin consumption continued to rise. It was only when, as we'll learn at our final stop, the government decided to focus on gin distillers that they really had any success at all. So we've now turned off the Thames and we're heading up to Fleet Street for the final bit of running on the tour today. So Fleet Street is known for its press and printing history, and the reason that we've come up here at Bouverie Street is so that we can nip through Magpie Alley, which was one of my favourite finds in this part of London. So it's just a little alley on the right here, and there's a mural as you go through, all dedicated to the history of the area. And then there's also the old Jacobean Whitefriars Theatre that was known for its homoerotic plays at that time. I was so excited when I found this. Actually, I used to work just up here on the left on Bouverie Street. I used to work in the metals industry, and it was whilst I was working here that I set up Secret London Runs. And I said to my employees at the time, you know, we'll just have a couple of tours a month and things will go on as normal. And it didn't really work out like that. And, you know, thousands of people have joined us, and I sometimes do a bit of freelance work to pay the bills. But now actually I've had a baby, and so Secret London Runs is hopefully going to be my only job apart from looking after Ezra. So it has been really, really overwhelming, the number of people that come and run with us, and I really hope that it will continue again after all of this is over. But thank you for everyone who supported us, and I guess we better run to our final stop now.
So by 1738, there have been a number of laws that have been passed, and they'd failed. Gin lovers, gin sellers, gin distillers kept finding loophole after loophole, and gin consumption continued to rise. My favourite loophole was one exploited by a man called Captain Dudley Bradstreet. So he found out that if an informant was going to be successful, they needed to know who was renting the property where the gin was being sold. So he got his friend to anonymously rent out a flat in Blue Anchor Alley, and under a cloak with £13 worth of gin and a few weeks worth of food, he went in and barricaded himself through the door. And then he put a statue of a cat in the window. So there was a hole in the mouth, and there was a little pipe coming through his pores. So people would come, he let it be known that gin was available from the cats in the alley. So people would come into the alley and they'd say, "Puss!" And if Captain Dudley Bradstreet was there, he'd say, "Mew." And then people would put their money through the mouth of the cat, and then Captain Dudley Bradstreet would pour gin through it, and you might have a dram there, or you might just suck. So this became known as the Puss and Mew method, and it became a very popular way of continuing to drink gin when the government were trying to stop it. By 1751, there was still no real progress. And so the government passed an act, I love the name of this act, it's called the Tippling Act of 1751. So what that said was that gin distillers needed to distill in batches of 18 hectolitres or more, and they could only sell to inns and taverns. Then there was a bad harvest in 1757. All the grain that had previously been used to make gin had to go to feed the country, and gin distillation was outlawed. So then the gin craze was over. So that's the end of the little portion of London's gin history that I'm going to share with you today. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty thirsty, so I'm going to run back home and I'll see you for a gin there. So usually we end a gin tour with a well-earned G&T together, but today I've run home and I'm having it here instead. So thank you everyone for joining me. I've loved having you here. If you enjoyed it, then please do press like. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you know when we launch another one, and let other people know who you think might be interested. Hopefully run with you properly again soon. Cheers.